All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I am so excited to be talking to you about patio gardening for wildlife tonight. My name is Diana Colangelo. I'm a Maryland Master Naturalist intern, and I am heading into my third year of having a native plant patio garden. So I wanted to do this webinar because when I was first starting out on this journey, I felt like there was not a lot of concrete advice for people who are looking to do this. A lot of the organizations and the people who write about native plant gardening really tend to focus on, having a little bit of property. They assume that you at least have some property. So I've learned a lot just doing this over the last couple of years. So I wanted to share with all of you what I've learned, including some very concrete guidance and like kind of step-by-step guidance about how to set up a patio garden for wildlife. So I'm going to get into that sort of the nuts and bolts of patio gardening for wildlife later in the presentation. I wanted to start with some of the more inspirational part of this, because if, like me, you are interested in doing this because you want to support wildlife where you live, you might be thinking, how much of a difference can a patio garden really make, right? Well, it turns out that it actually can make a pretty big difference. So this is a list of the animals that I have seen on my patio. This is over 50 species. And just to give you a little bit of context, my patio is about 50 square feet. It is situated in a complex and within a neighborhood that is very heavily suburbanized and perfectly manicured. So if you were to walk around my neighborhood, you might think that it looks very nice. It has some mature trees, but the aesthetic is really one of kind of like a golf course is how I would describe it. It's turf grass, hedges, mulch. There are really no leaves on the ground to speak of, very little in the way of flowering plants, and I would say almost nothing in the way of native flowering plants. So to give you an example, I really almost never see butterflies in my neighborhood, and yet I've seen about 10 different species of butterflies on my patio, including a monarch who found her way to the one milkweed plant that I had the first year that I was doing this. I have also seen a specialist bee. I have a crimson-eyed rose mallow, which is a hibiscus plant, and I have seen specialist hibiscus bees on that plant, despite the fact that I'm pretty confident there's probably not another one of those plants anywhere near my neighborhood. So the fact that these creatures have found their way to this tiny little space that has resources for them is amazing to me. And I think it's a real testament to the idea that if you build it, they will come. And even a small patio space can make a difference. So what I'm going to do in the first part here is I'm going to talk about the different kinds of wildlife that I have seen on my patio. And kind of give you some tips and tricks for how to welcome them to your space. I'm going to start with pollinators because they are, of course, the superstars of any garden. And it'll also, because the main attractor for pollinators is, of course, plants, it'll give me the opportunity to start by sharing with you all of the plants that I have on my patio. So I have about 30 species of plants. And I can attest to the fact that these all work in pots because they have worked for me in pots. I will just note, some of you folks may be joining us from outside of the Mid-Atlantic region. So these are plants that are local, native to the Mid-Atlantic region. You'd want to make sure that they're native to your area as well if you're interested in them. And I'll also be sharing resources later about how to find plants that are local to your region. So I also, so some of the main things that you want to think about when you are, oh, sorry, I just went past. So some of the main things that you want to think about for selecting plants for pollinators. One is that you want to select some plants that have very early bloom times, late bloom times, and everything in between so that you're providing resources for your pollinators throughout the growing season. Another thing to consider is that you want plants with different types of bloom qualities. So bloom structures, bloom sizes, different colors of blooms, and that will welcome a really diverse array of pollinators. So those are just some high level things to think about. Now, I am aware that certainly not all of you are going to want to have 30 plants on your patio, and you might be wondering, what are your top recommendations, your superstar pollinator plants? And so for me, my real superstar plants that I would recommend are in this left column here, these first 5 in the left column. Now, if I could only pick one plant, it would be Joe Pye weed. So Joe Pye weed is a nectar and pollen factory. It just never seems to run out. And the butterflies and bees are on those. I have 2 of them are on those plants like all day long. And the variety that I have is called coastal Joe Pye weed. So it is sometimes referred to as baby Joe because it does not get as tall as other varieties of Joe Pye weed. So it makes it a good one for pots. So I'm going to talk about the other 4 in my favorites list as I show you pictures of the pollinators on my patio. But I'm going to just first kind of continue with this list and share some of the other plants. So I have a couple of zigzag goldenrods. Those are great late bloomers. They attract a lot of things. Any native penstemon, so like this foxglove beard tongue, is going to be a really nice early bloomer that is much appreciated by the bees before other things are in bloom. Mountain mints are really good pollinator magnets. Crimson-eyed rosemallow, I mentioned already in terms of the specialist bee, but this is also kind of a fun one because it has really big showy blossoms, which not a ton of our native plants do. So it's just kind of a fun thing to have on the patio. Coral honeysuckle is great for hummingbirds. Eastern red columbine is a really good early bloomer. Mine is totally blooming. It's totally in bloom at this point already. Any kind of bee balm, also called Monarda plants, those are really good pollinator magnets as well. Cardinal flower is great for hummingbirds. Virginia spiderwort is a really good early bloomer as well. I actually have that planted in the edge of my patio along the side, so it's not in a pot, but it grows really well there. It spreads pretty easily, and it's a good early bloomer. These are the 2 asters that I have. Those are good late bloomers. And then the next 2 here, the phlox and the geranium, are great early bloomers. And then wild ginger, this is actually a picture of the ginger on my patio. I have planted it along the edge of my patio. I basically try to get as much native plant matter as I can on my patio. So in the pots, and I plant in the sides where the ground is. And so this is just a really nice ground cover. It's very pretty, and it is a host plant for the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about the the plants on this page, other than to say that if you are interested in having a grass on your patio, little blue stem is a really nice grass. You need kind of a big pot for it, but it works in pots, and it has really lovely winter interest. So it turns this beautiful rusty red color. So that's a really lovely one too. So let's now look at some of the pollinators that have visited my patio with these plants. So swamp milkweed is beloved by everything, not just monarchs. On the right here, you see a dark morph eastern tiger swallowtail. This creature in the middle is a hummingbird clearwing, which is a type of moth, and it's beautiful. It hovers just like a hummingbird when it's foraging, and I had never seen one before in my life, and so I was very happy that it came to my patio. A couple other different kinds of milkweed that you might try include common milkweed, and then there's also butterfly weed, which has orange blossoms, and it prefers drier and sunnier conditions than the swamp milkweed. So if that's more appropriate to your patio, you could consider that instead of the swamp milkweed, which likes part shade and more moisture. So white turtlehead, I love white turtlehead. I think that goldenrods and asters tend to get all of the credit for being good late bloomers, but white turtlehead is a fantastic late bloomer. It blooms for a very long time, very late in the season. It is also a host plant for the Baltimore checker spot butterfly, though I would not hold your breath for attracting those because I think they need larger patches of it. But it attracts lots of different kinds of bees. And just a funny little anecdotal fact with this with this carpenter bee that is in this blossom. This carpenter bee is actually not foraging. It is just hanging out in that blossom. So I have noticed this behavior for 2 years with carpenter bees where they'll just go into the blossom, hang out for a while, go into another one for like an hour and hang out. So you will notice some kind of funny, quirky behavior from your pollinator visitors sometimes if you're observing closely. Blue vervain, I also really love. Blue vervain has very tiny blossoms, and so it attracts all of the large pollinators and butterflies, but it also attracts in numbers a lot of very small pollinators. So like little sweat bees, and I get megachile bees on this plant, which are leafcutter bees. It also has a very pretty growth habit. It just grows up on a stem, and then it has this spray of purple flowers at the top, which is very pretty. So I really enjoy this plant. So I talked about the Joe Pye weed being amazing. The great blue lobelia is also amazing. With these two plants in particular, I often feel like I am running a bee bed and breakfast, lunch and dinner, because the bees are on these plants 24 hours a day, literally. So these two pictures in the center are sleeping bees. So one is sleeping on the Joe Pye and the other is sleeping on the lobelia. You can also see a sweat bee here on the lobelia on the right. And then this bottom picture I just thought was very cute because the bees have to go into the bloom to get the pollen. So this is a bee going into the bloom, and those two reddish spots on the sides are her pollen baskets. So I just thought that was a cute picture. So wild bergamot, also known as bee balm, also known as Monarda, which is its genus name, attracts lots of things as well. This second picture is an orange mint moth, and Monarda is actually in the mint family. And so I've seen it on this plant. I've seen it on my culinary mint, but it's just a great plant. This is my narrow leaf mountain mint, which also attracts lots of different things. This is a Horace's dusky wing butterfly, which I had never seen before in my life, and I thought it was really beautiful. So a couple other thoughts about how to support bees. You probably heard of the concept of bee hotels. There are different viewpoints on bee hotels. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but I think there is generally consensus that very large bee hotels are not good because they concentrate predators and disease. But I had read Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, a couple of years ago, and he talked about creating just very small bee hotels that just have like a few holes, and then you can kind of like distribute them around your property. And so I decided to try that last year. I got absolutely no play on it last year, except for a funnel weaving spider that took up residence in one of the holes. But I just checked on it 2 days ago. This picture is from 2 days ago, and it is fully occupied. So the bees have gone in there and laid their eggs and then sealed off the entryways. So I'm kind of excited to see what happens there. So if you want to do something like a bee hotel, just keep them small, try to shelter them from rain if possible. I've read that you should replace them every year to prevent disease and pests because you can't really clean the holes very well. And then also, of course, leave stems for stem nesting bees in terms of your plant material at the end of the growing season. So I also just wanted to show some pictures of some other critters that have come to my patio. Lots of spiders. I love spiders. I think they're amazing creatures, so they're always very welcome. I've seen a few different kinds of damselflies. This is a candy-striped leafhopper on the top here. And I wanted to just make a note on the two pictures on the right. So this picture of this bumblebee and this gray hair streak butterfly, they are sharing some chive blossoms. So they're sharing some chive blossoms, and I will just mention that pollinators really like the flowers on herbs. So if you have some herbs, the conventional wisdom is to pinch off the flowers to have the plant concentrate on foliage. But if you're willing to share with your pollinator friends, they really do love all of the flowers of the different herbs. I have an herb garden on my balcony, and they really love those flowers. This picture on the bottom here is a fraternal potter wasp, so named because of this beautiful little nest that it makes, which looks like a little clay vessel. It is a native wasp. It is solitary and non-aggressive. I see them a lot on my patio. They have never once bothered me. So I just wanted to include this picture to encourage a little bit of wasp love, because I think, there's a lot of fear of wasps. And keep in mind, even that with our social wasps that become aggressive, like hornets and yellow jackets, they become aggressive because they're defending a nest. But when you see a wasp foraging in a garden, it is kind of not in that mindset. It's just trying to find food, and it's not really going to be much of a threat to you. So hopefully being a little bit open-minded about your wasp visitors, which are important parts of our ecosystems as well. Okay, so, oh, sorry. Okay, so moving on to the amphibians. So the amphibians have been a real joy for me, and in large part because I did not expect them. I sort of unintentionally did a couple of things that made the perfect living environment for them on my patio. So the first thing was that when I was setting up my patio, I didn't want to put my pots directly on the concrete, and I didn't want to put them in saucers where they would just be collecting water. So I had a friend who had some extra scrap wood. He cut a bunch of slats for me. Some were like quite thick and some were thinner. And so I put all of my pots up on slats. It turns out that this is the perfect home for amphibians. They absolutely love it. It is cozy, it's dark, it's damp, it is safe from predators, and it has a little bit of airflow. So no need to invest in any fancy toad abodes. You can just put your pots up on slats and they will love it. I think last spring I had something like 6 or 7 toads and frogs that were living under my pots. And this little frog here on the left, this gap is only like half an inch, but it was the perfect size for this little frog. So the other thing that you can do for amphibians that you can actually see in these pictures is to leave the leaves. I'm sure many of you on this call know that leaf litter is really good for insects, but it's also good for insect predators because it gives them a food source. So I think they really love that as well. The third thing that I wanted to mention is something that I would not necessarily recommend, but it happened, so I'm just going to tell you about it. So this picture all the way on the right, I had put out a bucket in an effort to control mosquitoes. I'm going to talk about mosquitoes a little bit later. But what ended up happening was that this bucket that was full of water and some straw had, I think, 3 different frogs that took up residence in it, like over the course of the whole spring and early fall. So I had like 3 different frogs living in there. And so this frog, as you can see, is sunning itself on the front porch, so to speak, of its little home. So if you wanted to try to create some kind of water feature for amphibians, I would just recommend kind of tucking it away among your pots and putting a mosquito dunk in it so that it doesn't attract, it's not a breeding ground for mosquitoes. But you kind of want to leave it alone, unlike with a bird bath. So you might want to like kind of tuck it away among your pots. So mammals, the mammals are obviously a little bit skittish when I'm on the patio with them. So the first 2 pictures are not mine, but I did take this picture from my window of a bunny that is taking shelter under my patio wall. So that's the main thing that the bunnies do. They'll come to my patio and just kind of rest in the shade. They will also take an occasional nibble of a plant or 2, but they've never really destroyed any of my plants, so I don't have any problem with that. The squirrels will definitely utilize water if you have water on the ground. So that's something that you can offer to them. Another thing that they do is they will dig in the pots. I know this bothers some people, but it does not bother me because I have not had them actually ruin any plants. I think if you have bulbs, it might be a different situation. They might, dig up bulbs, but I think, just digging around in the pots, they haven't ruined anything. They bury their nuts in my pots. I had 1 or more squirrels who buried lots of peanuts in my pots last year, and I just thought that was kind of cute. So the chipmunk was an interesting story because, again, given the sort of sterility of the area that I live in, it's not a great environment for chipmunks, and I don't really see chipmunks very much. I noticed this chipmunk after I planted the wild ginger in the side of my patio. So I think that the thicker root structure of the ginger and then the cover of the leaves just created a really nice little micro habitat for the chipmunk. And so I noticed her quite a bit over a few weeks, and I think she was actually living there. And then, as too often happens in my development, the landscapers descended one day. There were 6 guys with leaf blowers making just a horrible racket. I'm sure you know how it is. And I saw her go tearing off the patio, and she never came back. So there will be things that are beyond your control, but I felt like I had offered this nice little microhabitat for the chipmunk, so I was happy about that. Okay, birds. So these are all of the birds that I have seen making active use of resources on my patio. Again, the birds are tough to take pictures of, so the only picture that's mine is the house sparrows that are bathing in the water dish. The main attractor for birds is, of course, water. I would very strongly encourage folks to put out water for birds and other wildlife. Our summers are very hot and they're getting hotter. And it's really important for birds to stay hydrated. And any place that they can find water, like the more sources, the better. I have a little human-made pond behind my my building, which is partly, I think, the reason that there are lots of amphibians. But you know, even despite that, I definitely get a lot of action at this bird bath. So definitely having water sources is really helpful. You do need to commit to keeping it clean, because if they're bathing every day, they're kind of getting it dirty and they're drinking from it. So you could do more harm than good if you don't keep it really clean. You don't have to have anything fancy for a water dish for birds. Mine is just basically a rigid plastic saucer from a plant pot, and it works great. They love it. So if you wanted to do something fancier, if you have access to power especially, you could get a heated bird bath, which is easier to manage in the winter. You could also get something with a bubbling feature, because they do like the sound of bubbling water. A couple other things that I would mention with the bird bath. So if you've never put out water for birds before, and you try it and you don't see any action, don't lose hope, because it takes a while for the birds to discover a new water source. It could take weeks. So just keep at it, and you almost certainly will get birds that come to it. And once they find it, they will use it a lot. The other thing I would say is try to keep your water source safe from cats. I used to put my water dish on the ground, and then I noticed a cat drinking from it one day, and I did not want the cat getting the idea that this was a good place to hunt birds that were bathing. So I moved it to a table, but I wanted to have a source of water for mammals and also birds that prefer water on the ground. So I have like just a little saucer like this big that I put on the ground so that they can take a quick drink, but it doesn't encourage lingering. And it actually gets a lot of action. Both of my water dishes get a lot of action. So that's kind of how I solved that for myself on my patio. A couple other things that the birds will do. If your patio is kind of just more natural and there are seeds falling and that kind of thing, you will see them foraging on the ground. I see that a lot with song sparrows and mourning doves. They'll just kind of, cardinals as well, they'll just forage on the ground. Sometimes they'll dig in the pots. And then the last thing with the birds that I thought was really great was, you know, you're often encouraged to leave plant material and stems up for overwintering bees. But what I have found is that in the spring, the birds use them for nesting material. I've seen several species collect nesting material from my patio. In fact, last spring, I had a pair of house finches that I think basically built their entire nest out of material from my patio. So they were going just back and forth all day for several days. So that was really fun to watch as well. So that's how to, a couple of things to support birds. So now that we've talked about the different wildlife and the different plants that you could have, I'd like to kind of move into the, you know, gardening in pots 101 section of this presentation. So by the way, this is my patio. So this is the space that I am working with here, and this is what it looks like. So, excuse me. So very first step for when you're trying to figure out, you know, how to do a patio garden. Some of the main things that you usually need to think about with gardening are, you know, the soil type and pH and the drainage of the soil. Those two things are kind of irrelevant when you're doing patio gardening, because you are providing the plants with, you know, well-balanced potting soil. You can't use ground soil for potted plants. And then you are responsible for the water. So they're getting as much or as little water as you're giving them. So the other consideration is the sun. So sun conditions. I would highly recommend doing a little informal sun study, even if you think you're familiar with the conditions on your patio, because you might learn something. So basically what I did was I took pictures of my patio every half hour or hour from when the sun came onto it to when it was gone from the patio. And then I broke my patio into little sections, and then I put a check mark, where if that spot was getting sun at that time. So you can see that there's actually quite a bit of variety even on my patio. There's some spots that get almost no sun. There's some that get 1 or 2 hours, some that get 4 or 5. So if you do something like that, it might just help you to understand, how much sun you're getting. And then you want to match, your plant selections to, the conditions that they will like for the sun. There's a little bit of flexibility there. You don't, have to be really militant about it, but you do, of course, not want to put like sun-loving plants in a really shady spot or shade-loving plants in a, baking hot patio. So do just try to be aware of the sun conditions. So we've talked a little bit about, the plants that I have and some of the things to think about when you're choosing plants for pollinators. But I wanted to just share with you some resources for picking plants for your patio space. There are a ton of resources online. So this is really just an effort to not overwhelm you. These are some good sources. I would say the top 3 were the most helpful for me. This top screenshot is a list of the National Wildlife Federation's keystone plants for our ecoregion. Again, if you're joining us from outside the Mid-Atlantic, they have ecoregions for the whole country. You can find it on their website. The second screenshot is native plants for the Mid-Atlantic. Again, they have them for all the different regions of the states. And you can find that on their website. And so that's really helpful for looking at, superstar plants that you might want to consider. The thing that was another resource that was really helpful to me was this first one, wildflower.org, which is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildlife Center in Texas. It's their website. And I found this one helpful, not necessarily to give me suggestions of lists of plants, but more like if I was choosing between a few different plants, I would look the plant up on that website because it gives you all of the information about the plant. It tells you how tall it gets, what kind of moisture it likes, what kind of sun it needs, what it attracts, what it's a host plant for, how to propagate it, etc. So it gives lots of information. So if you are deciding between a few different plants, that's a good resource for just, kind of making some more informed decisions and getting more information. So in terms of resources for buying plants, wherever you live in the country, I would encourage you to focus on local native plant sales. So these are folks that care about this stuff. They're usually growing these plants locally. They are passionate about it, and that it's just a really good source. So a lot of my plants the first year came from the Montgomery County plant sales. I have nothing but positive things to say about that. My plants have done really well. They're very healthy. And so the Montgomery County plant sales are actually coming up right now. I think a lot of their sales are in May. So if you go onto their website, you can find information about when their sales are. I also supplemented the second year with some plants from the Muddy Branch Alliance plant sale, and I was also very happy with those. So I speak very highly of those, and those are the ones that I know best. So I'm including a couple of other local nurseries that focus on native plants because I've heard good things about them. We have Lauren's Garden Service, which is in Ellicott City, Earth Sangha, which is in Springfield, Virginia, I believe. Bonatera, which is a very small operation that does not have a brick and mortar location, but if you go on their website, you can figure out what their system is for selling plants. So those are, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the ones that that have worked for me or that I've heard really good things about. I would highly recommend that you avoid big box stores like Home Depot. These places are really not, it's not their mission to be growing healthy, local, native plants. It's just not really their business model. And a lot of their plants are probably grown with systemic neonicotinoids. It's a common practice with some of these larger nurseries, which you definitely want to avoid. And even if you're getting plants from some of our smaller local nurseries, if they don't focus specifically on native plants, you might want to ask them if their plants are grown with systemic neonics, because you, again, want to avoid that. I would also encourage buying straight species when possible, so not hybrids, and local ecotypes. So local ecotypes are the most adapted plants for our conditions. They have the best developed, partnerships with our pollinators, all that sort of thing. So when possible, try to do that as well. Okay, soil. So a lot of potting soil, as I mentioned, you kind of have to use potting soil. You can't really use ground soil for potted plants. A lot of potting soil has peat in it. Peatlands are enormous carbon sinks, more so than pretty much any other habitat on the planet. When we harvest peat, which includes sphagnum moss, by the way, it releases tons, literally gigatons of greenhouse gases. Peatlands also filter water, they protect against flooding, and they provide really unique and critical habitat. And a lot of peat lands are harvested for gardening purposes. So we do not need to be part of that problem. The good news is that you don't have to sacrifice performance to avoid peat. I kind of stumbled across this potting soil my first year when I was on the hunt for peat-free soils, and it is American Plant's brand of soil. It is peat-free. It is composed primarily of coconut husks, rice hulls, and worm castings. And it's just a very quality soil. My plants love it. They've all been planted in this soil, and they're all doing really well, and they come back year after year. So I can't speak highly enough about this soil. I have tried a couple of peat-free soils that are like newspaper based. That's sort of the base of them. I don't recommend those. They're a very strange consistency. They get really waterlogged, and my plants did not like those at all. So finding and buying pots. I generally hate to recommend plastic for anything, but I do recommend plastic for your pots, mostly because of soil retention, especially if your patio gets really hot afternoon sun. Your plants are going to dry out pretty quickly, even in plastic, but pots like terracotta are going to dry out really, really fast. Glazed ceramic is a little better, but unless you happen to have a lot of that lying around, it is very expensive. So the good news is you can do a couple of different things to avoid having to buy new plastic pots. Of course, ask your friends, ask your neighbors, post to neighborhood listservs to see if people have pots that they're willing to get rid of. But another thing that you can do is you can experiment with different types of containers at secondhand stores that could function as pots. So I went to like the Goodwill, Salvation Army, Planet Aid, and I was trying to find things that could serve as pots. So in this top picture here, like this blue tub looking thing was like a laundry tub or something from Planet Aid that I just drilled some holes in, and it's been working great. Right here on the top, you can see I actually even tried closet organizers. These are closet organizers, and I drilled holes in them and figured I'd give it a try for pots. So this picture is from like when I first potted things. This picture on the bottom is from last week. So you can see that the black one has actually held up pretty well, and the gray one has completely fallen to pieces. So as with any experiment, you win some, you lose some, but I think it's a nice way to just try to avoid having to buy lots of new plastic pots. Out of the 30 or so pots that I have on my patio, I think I only bought 5 new plastic pots. And this is, of course, a cheaper option as well. So daily care and maintenance. You do need to water patio pots a lot, especially in the height of summer. Again, we have very hot summers. And if you get really hot sun in the afternoon, you're just going to have to water almost daily. And really, rain doesn't help unless we get like a really drenching torrential rain. So even if you just get showers, it's not really going to be enough to keep your pots happy and as moist as they want to be. Another thing that I would just mention is don't love your plants to death. And what I mean by that is I have not found there to be a huge need to add compost and soil amendments and this kind of stuff to my plants. They seem to have kind of worked out their own little soil ecosystem. This is a picture of all of my plants from the last week that are just coming back in the pots this spring. So if you feel like your plants seem to be suffering from, some kind of nutrient deficiencies, or they really look like they're struggling, you could try to just do a very light top dressing of compost, or to apply like a compost tea kind of situation. But I would use it very sparingly. This is not the kind of thing where just because they're in pots, they need compost every 4 to 6 weeks or something like that. I think I've maybe used a compost tea maximum twice in 2 years. So just something to think about. I also recommend taking a wait and see approach with so-called pests. If you see something like I had some aphids on my milkweed last year, and I decided to just kind of wait and see what happened. And honestly, they sort of petered out. They didn't really take over the plant. So sometimes it helps to see if a natural predator will take care of the situation for you, just see what happens. If you feel like you really are being overrun by some kind of pest, I would just recommend that you look online for organic ways to deal with that, because you do not want to introduce any pesticides to a garden where you're trying to attract native animals. Another thing that I like to do is if you see earthworms on your patio, put them in your pots. You'll see them a lot of times, if it's raining on your patio, or if you lift up a pot, there might be some earthworms under it. So just scoop them up and put them in your pots. One of the problems with pots is that the soil can get very compacted. So if you add earthworms, they will aerate your soil and they will leave behind worm casting. So I like to do that. So overwintering, this was another sort of happy accident for me, because the conventional wisdom is that your plants need to be, sheltered somewhere, like in a garage close to the house, where they'll be protected from freezing temperatures and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't have anywhere to put my pots. I don't have any storage of any kind. So I just decided to leave them on the patio, and I figured that they would all die and that I would just have to rip them out and replant all the pots the next spring. But come, late February or early March, I noticed that I think it was my whitewood aster started to come back. And then sure enough, one by one, every single plant that I had came back in the pots. And they had been exposed to some very cold temperatures. We had like very low single digits, maybe even negative temperatures, but they came back. And I think one of the things that I did that was helpful, that I would highly recommend, is to top dress the plants, the pots, with a layer of leaves. So I just collected up a bunch of leaves and put a nice thick layer. And I think it provided insulation. It, provided some moisture retention. It protected the soil. So I think that was really helpful, and I would recommend doing that. If you really are worried about them drying out, if you have a really sunny spot, you could consider watering them a couple times over the winter. But honestly, I do not touch my pots at all over the winter, and they are all coming back. These are pictures from like the last week. So they don't need a ton of love over the winter, I guess is what I'm saying. Okay, so in terms of challenges, we already talked about plastic in terms of the pots themselves. The plastic is more of an issue the first year. It tends to become less of a problem once your plants are established and your whole setup is established. But a couple other things that cause a problem with plastic are soil bags. If you have a big patio garden, you're going to need a lot of soil. My best suggestion with that is, rather than taking a plastic bag and throwing it in the garbage, use it as a trash bag. It's not perfectly meant for that. You might have to tie it up with some twine or something, but that's what I did. I used them as trash bags, and at least you get a little bit more mileage out of them. For the disposable pots that plants come in, like if you're using a native plant sale, those are not recyclable. I'm not sure if folks realize that. At least they're not in Montgomery County. So there's a couple things you can do. A lot of the native plant sales that you buy the plants from may be amenable to taking them back, because it means they don't have to buy new plastic the next year. So offer them back to the places that you bought them. I know that Bonatera takes donations of plastic pots. It has to meet their specifications, so you can look at that on their website, but they take them back. neighbors might want them, nature centers might want them for different reasons. Another thing that you can do with them is if you're going to have some large plants, you may have some large pots that require a lot of soil. You can kind of use them as filler. So what I will do sometimes is, like, if I have, a pot this big, I'll kind of cut it in half, and then I'll take the side that has the holes in the top, and I will line the bottom of a big pot with it. So that does a couple of things. It means that you have to use less soil when you're filling it. And it also creates a little bit of breathing room on the bottom of the pot. So instead of the soil immediately getting compacted, it filters a little bit more slowly through those holes. So it's just another, potential use for those pots. Mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are a horrible problem. I'm not going to lie. And this is because the patio is often wet because you have to water it a lot. I have tried the bucket of doom, which you may have heard of, which is you basically take a bucket, you fill it with water and some straw to make it a little swampy, and then you put a mosquito dunk in it, which is supposed to attract the mosquitoes to lay eggs, and then there's a larvicide that kills the larvae. I think that the reason that this doesn't work very well on a patio where you have a garden is because the patio is filled with wet organic matter. So it doesn't create much of a target. I've heard people say this is effective, but I think it's more effective, like if you're entertaining on an outdoor patio that's dry and you're, having dinner out there with your family, and then you have this one sort of target for the mosquitoes, I think it's more effective. By all means, try it. It's very low effort to do it, but I haven't found it to be effective on my patio. So a couple things to think about. I think this summer going to try to sprinkle mosquito bits around my patio. Same idea as the dunk, except you're kind of, distributing it a little bit more. I would also suggest looking into this trap. I suggest this trap because I have a friend who uses it, and he estimates that it has decreased mosquitoes on his property by 80 to 90%, and he has a whole yard. He said that the problem went from barely tolerable to barely noticeable. And I posted this on a listserv recently, and I actually heard from a native plant landscaping company that said that they had tested this trap with a lot of their clients last summer and seen really good success with it. I've also heard people say that these are not effective for mosquito control, but I do think there's a distinction to be made between controlling mosquitoes at like a city or county level, like overall mosquito population numbers, and just controlling them on your property. And I think it seems like, anecdotally at least, this trap is potentially effective for the latter, so controlling them on your property. As with anything, do your research, take a look into it, see if it might be something for you. I would buy it in a second if I had a place to plug it in, because it requires power, but I do not. So someday maybe, but just something to look into. Watering, I am including as a challenge, because if you do not have an exterior spigot for water or some kind of rain barrel or some way to get a lot of water outside, it is a lot of work to bring it back and forth, to be schlepping it from inside to outside to your patio. So there's kind of no way around that. It is just a lot of work. I'm also considering it a challenge because having a patio garden is a little bit like having a pet. You can't really leave it for more than, I would say, just like a couple of days, especially in the winter. I'm sorry, not the winter, especially in the summer when it is really, really hot, when we have hot spells. If you leave for like a week at a time and it's not watered, it's not going to go well for your plants. So if you travel a lot in the summer, that's a real consideration. If you don't have anyone who is willing to water for you, you might want to offer like a local high school kid some extra money to do it or something like that. But it is a real consideration that you have to think about. So we've talked about a lot of different things: the plants, the wildlife, how to actually put together this patio garden. I want to just leave you with a few final thoughts. The first is, don't be afraid to experiment. I had people tell me that plant won't work in a pot, that plant won't work in a pot, and I tried it anyway, and they worked pretty well. And honestly, even if a plant doesn't, what's the big deal? Like, if it doesn't work, you've learned something from the experience and you can try something else the next time. So the stakes are really not that high. So just have fun, experiment. If you want to try a plant, try it. Something else that occurred to me is that this could be a really interesting teaching tool for kids. I don't have any kids myself, but having a patio garden is an opportunity for very close observation. So if you had a child that you wanted to kind of expose to nature in this way, and you had them take responsibility for, let's say, one plant, and they picked it and they planted it and they watered it and they watched it grow and they watched what pollinators came to it and then watched it, die away in the fall. It could just be a really great opportunity for a very close relationship with nature, very close to home. So I just thought that could be interesting. I also want to say, have fun. This really should bring you joy. If you ever find that you're thinking, this is so much work, I hate it, stop doing it, or ratchet it back to a level where you are having fun and it is bringing you joy. Because that's really the point, is to see these creatures on your patio and to just love seeing them and love supporting them. So do that at whatever level works for you. And on that point, I want to also just say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I've talked to you today about having this huge patio garden with 30 plants and all this stuff. If you've been listening to that and thinking that's totally overwhelming, I can't do that, you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it in that way. Do it at whatever level is makes sense for you and your life and your space. Even if you just do a few things, it will be really helpful. So pick 5 plants, just 5 superstar plants that you think you can take care of. Commit to leaving a little bit of leaf litter on your patio, and perhaps commit to leaving some water out for birds and other wildlife that you can keep clean on a regular basis. And even just that will make a really big difference. So kind of related to that, my final thought is, you don't have to do everything, but do something. So turn a gray space green, and your wild neighbors will certainly thank you for it. So that is what I have for you tonight. This is my email. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to talk about native plants, and I'll definitely get back to you. Otherwise, I'm happy to take questions for the rest of the time that we have together.
Thanks, Diana. That was awesome. There were just a few questions in the chat. You can probably see them yourself, but I think they were mostly about where to get planters, how deep they should be, what you're filling them with. I know you covered some of it in your talk. If you can use compost.
Sure. Yeah. Let me take a look at these. How do you fill very deep planters with what? Yeah. So I still, like I said, if you have a really big pot, like I have a very large pot for like my coral honeysuckle and a few other things. I do just fill them with soil. I try to, as I mentioned, sometimes put a little bit of filler material in there, like the plastic pots, as I mentioned, so that they can kind of, the soil can kind of filter through there more slowly. But I do just fill them with soil. I don't have any like enormous, like, sort of huge garden bed type of planters. I have mostly pots, and none of them are so big and deep that it would, be hard to fill them with soil. So I'm not sure, I don't have any advice really for super, super huge planters, but I still think you would need potting soil because, there's kind of not really any other way to do that. So that's a good question about the ideal pot and planter depth. I would say that the best way to determine that is I was mentioning wildflower.org, which tells you how tall the plants get. And that gives you a little bit of a sense, it's not always a direct relationship with how deep the roots are, but if it's a pretty small pot, if it's a pretty small plant that doesn't get very tall, you probably don't need like a super deep pot. But if you're doing something bigger, like for example, the Joe Pye and the swamp milkweed, they get pretty big. I think the planters that I have for those are like 13 or 14 inches. If that helps. I'm not sure about the depth, but I think usually they're kind of proportional. So if you have, 13 or 14 inch pot, that's probably an appropriate depth for those plants. And again, it's going to change from plant to plant, though. I have some that are actually in pretty small pots. It just depends on what the plant is and how tall it gets. I have a shaggy blazing star that is in like maybe a 8 or 9-inch pot. So it kind of just depends. So I'm not sure if this question was asked before I answered this, but where I get my pots and containers, like I said, I try to just be creative. I've asked neighbors and, you know, folks to if they had plants or pots that they were looking to get rid of. I have bought a few. I think I bought the ones that I bought at American Plant, the new plastic ones that I bought, but then I just experimented with other stuff, which is also, like I said, a cheaper way to do that. And again, no big deal if it doesn't work super well. You can try something else the next time. Compost. So again, I mentioned that one too a little bit. Yes, it works, but like I said, I would really encourage you to not assume that just because your plants are in pots, they need a lot of compost. My plants they're on their 3rd year of coming back. I've done very little in the way of adding compost to them. I think you know, our native plants are hardy. They're adapted to lots of different kinds of conditions, including poor soil. And I think they kind of work out their own little soil ecosystem, as I mentioned. So you can do it. I would say, like, if you really want to, maybe like once a season, maybe later in the season, just top dress lightly with compost or do a compost tea. But I would not kind of go crazy with that. Let's see. I think that's about everything. So any other questions? People could unmute themselves if they want, I think. Ask anything verbally. No? No questions about wildlife? Oh, one more. No, nope. Yeah. So if no one has any other questions, I mean, you could feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself. But if no one has any other questions, I guess we could end a little bit early, Payhan, if that works.